They say MotoGP is a sport of milliseconds, but Jorge Lorenzo has just shattered that illusion with a single sentence, one that feels less like analysis and more like a fault line cracking beneath the championship. Marquez will be brutal on an Aprilia. Not faster. Not better. Brutal. A word that doesn't describe performance, but consequence. And suddenly, every lap of this wild, unpredictable season looks different. Every swing in form, every shock podium, every whisper of aerodynamic genius from Noali. Because if Aprilia has truly built a machine that bends physics instead of obeying it, what would happen if the rider most capable of breaking those same laws stepped onto it? Lorenzo doesn't speak like a pundit. He speaks like a man who has survived the machinery that shapes champions and destroys them, a man whose scars understand what data alone cannot explain. And in his voice there is no exaggeration, only the cold, trembling truth of someone who knows exactly what Marquez does to a bike, and what a bike like Aprilia would unleash in return. The question isn't whether Marc would win. The question is whether the grid, the sport, and the limits themselves could withstand the version of Marquez that Aprilia would awaken. And once you imagine that, there's no going back. Jorge Lorenzo arrives in the paddock with the calm of a man who already knows the earthquake he is about to trigger. And when he declares that Aprilia is now at Ducati's level, the air bends as if the garage doors themselves inhaled in disbelief, yet he speaks with the cold precision of someone who has lived at the heart of the timing screens for half his life. He recalls studying the data late at night. "I saw things there that people don't want to accept," he mutters internally, feeling the familiar thrill of uncovering a truth that others fear to articulate. He explains that Aprilia's latest aero package generates a microvortex under the tail unit, a detail almost no one outside Noali's engineering division has noticed, and this small phenomenon whispers of a bike refined into a blade. Journalists feel the tension rise, like watching a tightrope under a performer who never trembles, as Lorenzo continues unpacking telemetry that shows Aprilia braking 3 meters later at Phillip Island. His voice blends nostalgia and steel, remembering how hard it once was to admit a rival brand had reached such terrifying completeness. He pauses, letting the words dig in, because he knows the story is no longer about loyalty, but about mechanical truth. The paddock listens the way people listen to confessions in a dark church, quietly and with a strange reverence. Inside his mind, he hears himself think, "They won't believe it until the first race proves me right," and that thought tastes bittersweet. He mentions torque curves, load transfer, and the eerie similarity of chassis flex data between the two machines. Someone asks him if he's exaggerating, and Lorenzo's smile slices the moment open. "If anything, I'm understating it," he replies, and the room stiffens. He paints a vivid picture of Aprilia dancing through mid-corner arcs with the delicacy of a glass sculpture suspended in motion. The metaphor lingers, fragile yet undeniable, reshaping everything the listeners assumed about hierarchy. He explains how Ducati's engineers secretly monitored Aprilia's acceleration traces during testing, surprised to find no weak zones left to exploit. A tremor moves through the technicians leaning against their pit walls, as if an old order were dissolving right beneath their boots. Lorenzo speaks of evolution as something quiet and ruthless, a tide that rises while everyone sleeps. His tone deepens, carrying shades of melancholy for an era when Ducati alone defined excellence. He warns that denying reality only delays the shock that will come when the lights go out on Sunday. His eyes drift toward the Aprilia box, where the mechanics work with a confidence bordering on serenity. The paddock understands that a turning point has just been named aloud. And as Lorenzo walks away, he leaves behind a truth shimmering like heat on asphalt. The balance of power has shifted, and nothing will ever be the same again. Jorge Lorenzo releases the line like a spark dropped in dry grass when he says, "Marc would be brutally fast on an Aprilia," and the paddock reacts with that sudden tightening of silence that precedes a storm nobody wants to admit is coming, because everyone knows Marquez rides like a man carving the air open with his bare hands. He watches the cameras blink and feels a whisper in his own mind. They're not ready for the version of Marc that bike would create, a thought that chills him more than it excites him. Lorenzo explains how Aprilia's front-end load distribution allows for deeper entry phases, a rare trait that perfectly matches Marc's instinct to slam into corners at angles that make engineers sweat. He adds a detail few have noticed. Aprilia's latest ride height control resets 0.04 seconds faster than Ducati's, a microscopic advantage that would feel to Marquez like finding an extra rung on a ladder no one else can see. His tone shifts between analyst and storyteller, describing Marc's body language on track as a flame bending around obstacles, a metaphor that draws nods even from skeptical technicians. Someone asks whether we should mourn the path not taken, and Lorenzo smirks as if the question itself were a trap. He chose Ducati, he says, but the universe where he chose Aprilia would have terrified everyone. The sentence hangs in the air like a shadow cast by a fire behind closed doors. The journalists scramble to capture every nuance, aware this idea introduces a new tension in the championship's narrative fabric. Lorenzo's eyes narrow as he imagines the pairing. Aprilia's stability under braking fused with Marc's hunger to invade the limits of physics. His inner voice murmurs, it would have been chaos disguised as elegance, and the thought feels almost sacred. He recounts how even test riders whispered that Marquez's throttle modulation would sync with Aprilia's torque delivery, like a heartbeat aligning with its rhythm. A mechanic listening from the sidelines exhales sharply, as if visualizing the ghost of a champion who never materialized. Lorenzo's cadence slows, cinematic and deliberate, as he recalls Marc's past saves, the ones that defied mathematical models and logic. He hints that Aprilia's aerodynamic wake would have amplified that magic instead of fighting it. The paddock feels suspended between what is real and what could have been. Then Lorenzo lowers his voice, turning the moment into a confession wrapped in prophecy. If Marc had chosen that garage, he concludes, we'd be rewriting fear itself. And with that, he seals a parallel reality more haunting than any victory lap. The season unravels like a deck of cards tossed into a storm, and when Jorge Lorenzo describes it as the most unpredictable championship in years, the words feel carved from the chaos itself as journalists struggle to keep track of winners who appear and disappear like brief flashes of lightning. He watches the timing screens with a mix of fascination and disbelief, thinking, not even the algorithms can predict this anymore, as each race redraws the hierarchy with merciless spontaneity. He points out that 5 different manufacturers have already shared podiums in the first stretch of the calendar, a statistical anomaly that engineers whisper about in the back of the garage. One detail escapes most viewers. Aprilia's improved corner exit traction has been decisive on circuits where Ducati once reigned uncontested, flipping expectations upside down. Lorenzo speaks with that blend of poetry and precision only he commands, describing the season as a compass spinning in the dark, pointing everywhere and nowhere at once. The reshuffling of contenders, Acosta today, Bezzecchi tomorrow, Martin when his body allows, creates a narrative rhythm that feels almost surreal. Reporters scribble frantic notes as Lorenzo's tone deepens, explaining how the psychological toll of such volatility forces riders to question their own instincts. His voice slides into an intimate register when he admits, confidence becomes a currency that devalues every Sunday, a sentence that makes even seasoned mechanics exchange uneasy glances. The metaphor grows sharper as he compares the grid to a glass chandelier swaying above a crowded room, fragile and unpredictable. A subtle tremor runs under his words when he reveals that teams have begun analyzing weather data and tire degradation with obsessive urgency, because anything, heat, wind, luck, can rewrite fate. The season's madness feels cinematic, charged with tension that never fully releases. Lorenzo reflects internally. This is the year where destiny refuses to sit still, and the thought gives him a peculiar thrill. He mentions how unexpected winners have fractured every preseason prediction, turning experts into gamblers. The emotional stakes rise with each race as riders cling to momentum like threads in a storm. The paddock senses the narrative swelling towards something unprecedented. Even factory teams admit privately that no one truly controls the championship anymore. Lorenzo lets silence fill the gaps before he drops his final observation. In a year where the ground keeps shifting, he says, imagining Marquez riding an Aprilia feels like imagining a match dropped into dry oil. And as he walks away, the paddock realizes this chaos is not merely background noise. It is the perfect stage for a legend who could have changed everything. Alex Marquez's emergence feels like the quiet blooming of a flower in a concrete crack, unexpected yet undeniable, and Lorenzo explains that the younger Marquez has stitched together a season so consistent that even the telemetry technicians admit privately they've had to recalibrate their expectations. He thinks to himself, people never saw him coming, but the data did, and that inner whisper carries the pride of someone who recognizes evolution when it finally breaks the surface. Lorenzo reveals that Alex has improved corner entry stability by nearly 4% compared to last year thanks to Aprilia's chassis flex pattern, a technical nuance so subtle that only engineers poring over microload charts would notice its impact. He mentions how Alex's riding now glides with the confidence of a lantern drifting upward, fragile yet brightly determined. When asked about Bezzecchi, Lorenzo lets out a slow breath before stating, "What Marco has done borders on unreal," a quote that lands heavily among reporters who understand adaptation doesn't come cheaply in MotoGP. The paddock watches Bezzecchi's transformation with intrigue, aware he has defied the typical 6 to 9 race window required for full adaptation to a new machine. His immediate synergy with the Aprilia feels like a chord perfectly tuned on the first pluck. Lorenzo notes a secret detail. Bezzecchi was the only rider to complete a full long-run simulation without drop-off in the opening preseason test, an achievement that left rival crews whispering. Inside himself, he reflects, some bikes don't just fit riders, they reveal them, and the thought resonates with quiet power. He describes Marco's style on the Aprilia as fluid, like ink spreading across water with impossible grace. Each race sees Alex and Marco dismantling old assumptions about what Aprilia machinery can deliver. Their performances shake the narrative loose from the idea that Ducati stands alone in technical supremacy. Lorenzo's tone gains an almost paternal warmth as he highlights how both riders carry a serenity that only comes from trusting their tools completely. Across the grid, rival engineers study Aprilia's data traces with increasing unease. Fans sense the shift too, feeling history tilt ever so slightly. With each podium and each shock result, the Aprilia proves itself not just competitive but transformative. And as Lorenzo concludes, he ties the threads together with a quiet punchline that feels like destiny taking shape. The rise of these two riders is more than coincidence. It is Aprilia revealing its true face at last. Jorge Martin's ordeal on the Aprilia unfolds like a slow-burning ache beneath the skin, the kind that riders never show on camera, and Lorenzo explains with a grave softness that Martin's difficulties come not from lack of talent, but from a body that refuses to cooperate at the speed modern MotoGP demands. He feels a knot tighten in his chest as he thinks, if only they knew how much he's riding through. Because every lap Martin completes is compromised by lingering injuries that steal precision from his wrists and courage from his instincts. Lorenzo reveals that Martin has logged nearly 40% fewer testing laps than Bezzecchi, a technical deficit invisible to fans but merciless in its consequences. He describes the Aprilia as a violin tuned to perfection, exquisite but unforgiving if the hands touching it tremble even slightly. When asked about the contrast, Lorenzo states, Marco arrived whole, Jorge arrived hurt, a line that slices through the paddock speculation with surgical clarity. The team knows that Martin's pain limits how deeply he can load the front tire, a tiny detail with massive repercussions, and this inability to feel the edge robs him of the fearlessness that once defined his riding. Inside himself, Martin wonders during quiet nights, how do you chase seconds when your own body becomes the first barrier, and the question feels heavier than any crash? Lorenzo paints the image of Martin's season as a lighthouse flickering in strong wind, refusing to go dark but constantly threatened by forces he cannot control. He explains how braking late becomes a gamble when tendons protest, how experimenting with setups becomes impossible when every stint must be shortened to avoid inflammation. The paddock watches and murmurs, sensing the emotional and physical toll tightening around him. Even rival riders admit privately that adaptation requires a healthy body before it can demand a sharp mind. Lorenzo speaks of the invisible battle, the hesitation, the protective instincts, the subtle fear of aggravating old wounds. Martin's data traces show microlifts in throttle, where Bezzecchi stays decisive, revealing the language of pain written in numbers. The engineers try to adjust, but Aprilia's nature demands a rider who can attack relentlessly. A cold truth settles over Lorenzo's final words as he says that in MotoGP 2025, the machinery waits for no one. And as he finishes, he seals the theme with a sentence that stays suspended in the air like a warning. Before you can adapt to the bike, you must first survive yourself. In the dim light of the paddock corridor, Lorenzo speaks with a weight that only veterans carry, explaining that injuries don't just slow a rider. They rewrite the brain's internal code, distorting timing, sharpening hesitation, and dulling the reckless instinct that once felt like second nature. He watches Martin and others walk with stiff shoulders and thinks, people don't understand that the body heals faster than the mind, a truth that feels almost forbidden to say aloud. He reveals a technical nuance spectators never see. After a heavy crash, micro-adjustments in a rider's muscle memory can delay throttle pickup by mere milliseconds. Yet those milliseconds are the thin line between glory and catastrophe. Lorenzo likens the psychological toll to a candle melting unevenly, still shining, still burning, but slowly losing its perfect shape. When asked how riders cope, he answers quietly, some don't. They just learn to hide it, a confession that chills even the mechanics pretending not to listen. The paddock whispers about how every crash leaves residue, a subtle tremor in trust that no engineer can calibrate away. Lorenzo explains that missed laps aren't just lost time. They're fragments of unlearned truths about tire behavior, fuel load shifts, and electronic mapping. Inside his own mind, he revisits memories he'd rather bury, thinking, I know exactly how fear can disguise itself as caution, and the reflection momentarily tightens his jaw. He paints the mental landscape of MotoGP as a tightrope strung between courage and survival, swaying above a void filled with doubt. Riders pretend they are steel, but Lorenzo knows they are more like glass, transparent, resilient, yet vulnerable to the smallest fracture. He describes the mind after injury as a GPS that suddenly mistrusts its satellites, recalculating constantly, nervously, endlessly. A journalist asks whether trauma is visible in the data, and Lorenzo nods, saying the story is told in softer corner entries and earlier lifts on the throttle. He compares the process of rebuilding confidence to tuning a piano after it has been dropped, possible, but requiring a master's patience. The tension thickens as he recounts how some riders grow quieter after big crashes, speaking less, thinking more. The cameras capture every word, but the real drama lives in the pauses. The championship's machinery roars like a beast indifferent to human fragility. Yet Lorenzo insists that the greatest battles of MotoGP happen not at 350 kilometers per hour, but inside a rider's skull. And as he finishes, he leaves a single sentence hanging in the charged silence, a truth too clear to ignore. The fastest laps are set by bodies in pain, but the victories belong to minds that refuse to break. Lorenzo unveils his list of favorites with the solemnity of someone reading names etched into stone, and the paddock leans in as he explains that the coming season will be shaped by a shifting hierarchy where talent, machinery, and timing collide with unprecedented ferocity. He looks toward Marc Márquez and thinks, he's starving again, and that's the most dangerous version of him. Knowing Marc arrives armed with Ducati's mechanical supremacy and years of pent-up hunger. He adds a technical gem many overlook. Ducati's latest swing arm dampens microvibrations by 11%, giving Marc the stability he once begged Honda for, a detail that could turn his aggression into something surgical. Then Lorenzo turns to Pedro Acosta, calling him a comet we only see once in a generation, a line that sends a ripple through the room. He describes Acosta's instinctive riding as a river carving its own path, fluid yet relentless, reshaping the track rather than obeying it. Alex Márquez stands next, the unexpected constant in a sport that devours consistency, and Lorenzo praises his evolution into a rider who understands momentum as both a physics term and a personal rebirth. Inside himself, Lorenzo reflects, Alex rides now like someone who finally believes he belongs, and the thought carries a warmth tinged with astonishment. Bezzecchi completes the quartet with a serenity that borders on eerie, the calm of a rider whose body is unbroken and whose machine, Aprilia's title-capable creation, responds to his touch like a trusted instrument. Lorenzo reveals a hidden fact. Marco's torque application is the smoothest on the grid, reducing tire degradation by fractions that become decisive over race distance. The metaphor he chooses paints the four riders as constellations in a sky rearranging itself, each star pulling gravity in its own direction. Journalists scribble madly, aware this list is more than prediction. It is prophecy. The emotional current tightens as Lorenzo explains that each contender represents a different storyline converging at terrifying speed. Redemption, ascension, validation, and unleashed potential. The tension spirals, cinematic and electric, hinting at clashes that will define an era. Rival teams listen with a mix of dread and admiration, sensing the truth in his voice. And as Lorenzo ends, he leaves a line so sharp it seems to echo off the pit walls. Next season won't choose its champion. It will expose him. Jorge Lorenzo speaks with the gravity of someone whose authority was forged in pain, not nostalgia. And every word he delivers carries the echo of his disastrous Honda chapter, the one where his elegant style collided violently with a bike that demanded brutality he could not give. He thinks to himself, people forget how much it costs to ride against your own nature, remembering the fractures, the surgeries, the lonely flights home with more doubt than dignity. He recalls a technical detail few mention. The Honda's 2019 chassis transferred load so abruptly that his precise corner entry technique became a liability, a mismatch that carves scars deeper than any headline. When he warns Martin to be patient, or praises Bezzecchi's adaptation, or acknowledges Aprilia's engineering miracle, he does so with the weight of someone who has paid full price for every misalignment between rider and machine. His voice becomes a lantern illuminating truths others prefer to blur. He describes his past as a cracked porcelain cup, once flawless, now marked, yet still capable of holding wisdom. I'm not judging, he says softly, I'm remembering. And the paddock understands this isn't commentary. It's testimony. Inside himself, he murmurs, "I wish someone had told me what I'm telling them now," a confession that trembles with melancholy. His admiration for Aprilia is untainted by politics because he has no team to protect, no brand to defend. He sees clearly what others hesitate to admit. Synergy is everything, and pain is the price when it fails. His gaze drifts toward the garage where the Aprilia sits like an animal, ready to leap. Lorenzo breathes in the thick scent of fuel and anticipation as he contemplates a hypothetical that feels dangerously real. And as he speaks his final line, the paddock goes silent, because he isn't speculating, he is predicting. If Marquez ever rode an Aprilia, the grid wouldn't be ready for the chaos that would follow.